Rich, how are you today, Mr. Lorge?
I don't know, you tell me.
Remember, no videos. I think it's a school rule. You can all audio. Consider that your permission. You don't have to ask me individually.
Okay, hopefully my parents don't call me that.
Well, then everybody else can get your ringtone on their audio. I thought you might ask. Okay. The first part is the imperialism unit, which you may recall began with the Spanish-American War. Yes? That was a long time ago. Right around there. Well, forward, crossword. No, forward, backwards. Right there.
This one.
Well, the other side. Those are yellow journalism headlines. So I would certainly know your Spanish-American War / imperialism stuff. One of the more famous primary sources to come out of the Spanish-American War was the document where we took over Cuba, a.k.a. the Platt Amendment. So, the Platt Amendment is a definite primary source. Then there was Roosevelt's twist on imperialism. Roosevelt's twist on imperialism was the
Roosevelt's corollary
to the
Monroe Doctrine.
What was the main idea of the Monroe Doctrine?
Europeans can't interfere with American politics or
With North, Central, or South America, can't recolonize. And the Roosevelt corollary was,
Like U.S. police.
we, on the other hand, are the policemen. This is entirely our domain. And so that's Roosevelt, the Panama Canal. I would say dollar diplomacy and Taft, much less so till Tuesday. Definitely could be worth a multiple choice question out of 48 or so. Probably not worth a short primary source or short essay out of 7 like Friday. So the end of imperialism would probably be the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. All right, next big foreign policy event, post-imperialism, was,
World War I.
okay, so World War I has a very European flavor, and so in an American history class, I couldn't ask any of the European-only stuff. So you're just going to have to know the background of the Eastern Front, the Western Front, and so on. Again, those could definitely be multiple choice questions, but the only stuff for Friday would be primary sources that directly relate to America. So what was the first way America really felt the sting of World War I? So I would certainly know my Lusitania, that little notice that was like, don't travel here. I was actually in the desk drawer of the German ambassador in Washington. You guys nodding vaguely like you remember that. Okay, so the whole Lusitania thing, America getting dragged into the war. When we entered the war, we needed to have a higher purpose to make the world safe for democracy. And this is where we get to Wilson's 14 points. Remember, if you were to see any specific of the 14 points, both classes will, I just don't know whether they'll be the same or different. Among the highlights were points 1, 3, 4, 5, and 14. So if you're only going to study 5 points, you really only need to study those 5. Study those 5 points. Then you need to know about the, the peace process itself, and so for each of those 14 points, each of those 5 points, you need to know, did it happen or not happen in the treaty that actually ended the war, the Treaty of Versailles? What's the answer generally? Did the 14 points get fulfilled in the Treaty of Versailles? Almost never. And so I believe I gave a little handout, and on the back of the handout was 1 3.5 line description of the actual clause from the Treaty of Versailles. The famous Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. So I'd certainly be able to recognize the War Guilt Clause from the back of a handout entitled Who Won the War, or the front of it is the Treaty of Versailles. The back of it is Who Won the War and Who Won the Peace. And about halfway down the handout is the War Guilt Clause, Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. So I would definitely make sure that you know that clause and what that clause means and how that part is unfair. Okay, then the last thing you need to know about World War I from the American perspective is something you don't have a primary source for, but you might need to explain, which is that after World War I, we I guess. But after World War I,
Isolated?
we went back to isolation, most notably from the most not joining the League of Nations, not ratifying the Treaty of Versailles, the whole ratification debate in the Treaty of Versailles. All right, the 1920s, very little foreign policy, back to domestic policy, very few primary sources, and the primary sources you do have are not really that primary, like those drawings of the flapper girl and the Victorian woman and the letter between Rockefeller and his son. Those were real, but what could you ask about that? So I'd say the 1920s would be much more of a short essay type of thing, like being able to explain the big picture, like what were the causes and results of women's success in the 20s, what were the causes and results of black people's success in the 20s, then like what was the backlash, the reaction against it. So who did the Klan go after? Why were they so popular? What did they do? Who did Palmer go after? Who was he targeting in his raids? Who got raided?
He went against Russia.
Well, anybody, communist, anarchist, Italian, Russian, Catholic, Jewish, anybody different. But especially it was supposedly fear of communists and anarchists. Why was Hollywood, why were people so nervous that a naked body could appear on a Hollywood screen? You know, why was the Klan so nervous about anybody other than the WASPs doing well? Why was Palmer so nervous about some Italian person going to a political meeting, et cetera, et cetera? So you have to know the backlash. So the least of the 20s is the politics. There probably would not be a Harding or a Coolidge or a Hoover question. There'd be much more likely to be a Flapper or a Harlem Renaissance or a Palmer Raids or a KKK or a Hollywood censorship question. Then the last part of the 20s that you would definitely want to know is how the economy, while it seems to be roaring, is actually setting the stage for a disaster, which would be known as the Great Depression or the stock market crash. So you need to know the laissez-faire attitude of the presidents, the gap in the wealth, the birth of credit and how people are rich, but they're not really rich. They just have big credit card bills and nice shiny new things, but they can't really pay for them. So the whole economic issue. All right. Probably Hoover's policies would be a lot to ask. So I would say after the 20s, the next thing would be a primary document I would guess that both of you would get. There's one primary document that's the most famous of this whole era. You could quote it by saying, and you could quote that by saying, first inaugural, yes, one. Yes, the only thing you have to fear is fear itself. So that could be expanded into a question about the whole election of 1932, why it's so important, who's saying this, what he's proposing, how this was a huge change in American history, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole FDR first inaugural New Deal thing. Then I would say we didn't look at the laws themselves, but I would say the New Deal itself is definitely something that short essays could be written about. So there are hundreds of New Deal programs. So I'd say you could nail it, you could reduce it to about 8, and probably each class might see 4, or get a choice, choose 3 out of 4. But included would be SEC, FDIC, PWA, WPA, CCC, TVA, then welfare, and Social Security. So I would definitely know those 8. Yes.
Part of the textbook took some time to start around the difficulties between the PWA and the CWA. Should we know that also?
No, I'm not even making you know the CWA. So I would definitely know those New Deal programs.
Can you repeat the first 3? SCC, FDIC, and PWA.
Wow, do you have one of those voice recognition things?
No, typing is
Wow, that's pretty scary. Okay, so now we have the New Deal. I don't think you have to know. It would be quite cruel, but unless I say something in class tomorrow, I don't think you have to know any of these like semi-elections. Like the only one you have to know is 1932. So like for the AP test or somewhere I would have it written down that between now and May 15th, you might want to briefly review the election of 1912, 1928, 1936, but probably not for tomorrow. And by the way, this is in the dead zone where there's no review session on it, so that review would come on your own. But like I said, in the next 6 weeks, not the next 48 hours. So after the New Deal, the next thing would be the court packing and sort of the resulting sort of end of FDR's first segment of his presidency. And then where it would end would be with this foreign policy we've done so far. How did FDR feel during the mid to late 30s and early 40s before Pearl Harbor, because we haven't gotten there yet? How did most Americans feel during the mid to late 30s and early 40s before Pearl Harbor? You know, what's one example where most Americans got their way? What's one example of a law where FDR got his way? So just sort of the whole like tug of war pre-Pearl Harbor about how involved we should get in European and Asian affairs. And I would say that would be it. Imperialism, World War I, documents, 20s, short answer, short essay. FDR and the New Deal, both documents and short answer, short essay. And the foreign policy stuff, that's going to be short essay. Remember, you don't have to study those documents that we looked at, like Frances Faviel, the girl who had the, who's putting the bodies back together, or Churchill, because those aren't actually American documents. Those are British documents, so those would not be eligible for an American history quiz. Questions? Yes?
Why was there Hollywood censorship?
Because if it's not, and you see a naked body up there, what does that imply? Like sex, maybe by not married people. Maybe sex between two non-Protestant people who could be procreating. These are dangerous ideas in traditional, white, church-going Protestant America. Sex for pleasure, very bad. Catholics and Jews expanding their populations in America, very bad. People acting risque, very bad. Other questions? Yes? Yes, FDR was really mad at the Supreme Court because they kept using judicial review to declare certain parts of the New Deal unconstitutional. So rather than dealing with it, which is what you're supposed to do when the judicial branch is exercising their check on the executive and legislative branch, he tries to figure out a way to change the way the Supreme Court is ruling by appointing more people onto the Supreme Court, even when nobody has died or resigned. So instead of having 9 on the Supreme Court, he would appoint 2, 4, 6 more. So there'd be 11, 13, or 15. He appoints them. They're going to magically find the New Deal constitutional. Instead of all these 5-4 votes against New Deal laws, there would be 6-5, 8-5, or 10-5 votes in favor of New Deal laws. That's what he tries. It never actually is enacted. The court packing plan is rejected. Court packing. Other questions? The sick chicken case is too much detail for anything on Friday. It could be the subject of a multiple choice question or 2 on Tuesday, but the sick chicken case was the most famous case, the Schechter case, in which the Supreme Court used judicial review to declare a certain part of the New Deal unconstitutional.